Okay, let's proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. Thank you, Ms. Magopeni. When we adjourned, you're still dealing with journalists, but there's something that you want to add about journalists and their safety currently. Maybe it's something that we need to talk about it since we're talking about journalists now, and you can just put that in.
Some of the challenges that our journalists are faced with are not only related to being intimidated by politicians on the stories they cover. They also relate to the public and how, as in yesterday, we had one of our vehicles attacked during the protest in Johannesburg, and the journalist who was covering a story was also attacked. So this is a problem for us. But as far as the financial situation of the SABC and how it applies to this case, when I joined last year, I asked for hostile environment training for our journalists. That hasn't happened because we can't provide that service. And protective gear, because it's got to happen one day that one of them gets exposed to a situation where I would be found wanting when I have to explain what happened. So this is a problem that we're facing. So it's not only the fact that they get intimidated when they cover stories, it's the fact that we expose them to risk by not offering them the right protection in such environments.
Okay. Thank you. And then going back to your statement, page 6, at paragraph 17. So you say the matters that you highlight, they are in need of strengthening. You're making sure that you have editorial controls and you ensure quality. Maybe before we proceed on as to how you are trying to, whatever it is that you've highlighted as having been problems, how you are trying to work on those and to make sure that those do not happen before we move on to other processes and systems.
What we have tried to do so far is starting with the editorial issues and journalists and the management of the newsroom. One of the things that have happened, despite the fact that you have this complex operation as SABC News that provides news services to all these platforms, there's no forward planning editor. And that's the first thing that we had to address, that there is a person who has to account for forward planning for that area. And this doesn't only apply to short-range planning. We need to plan for long-term events. And that means also managing the costs of our coverage when we deal with big events, because you would be able to book your accommodations in advance, book your travel flights in advance, and hire cars in advance if you have to travel to Cape Town or to any other place that's not Johannesburg. But because that forward planning function wasn't there, so it has always been a problem because we wake up to stories, literally. You wake up to a story that you have to deploy resources to without even interrogating the editorial rationale for covering that story. And the second part was, again, you look at the service that we're supposed to provide to the South African public in terms of their news and information needs. You have audiences that consume their content in African languages. There is no African languages editor in our newsroom. And this is despite the fact that this is your biggest audience as SABC News. Just looking at TV alone, your 7 p.m. bulletin on a daily basis is going to give you more than 3 million viewers. But there's no dedicated person who looks at the needs of those audiences in terms of content. And you can apply this across the languages on television. And as a result of that lack, you have audiences that are being served content that's generated for English audiences. So it's not tailor-made, and it does not talk to their needs, and it's not regional enough to address the needs of the audiences that we're talking about. Radio is different because our radio stations are spread across the country, so the local flavor is reflected in the content. of our radio facilities. But digital is similar to TV. There is no dedicated person who looks after the needs of the people who consume their content in African languages. And this is a big problem for us. The other part is looking at how the system is designed. We had a situation, and in fact it still exists, but we're in the process of addressing it now. We have a news operation that is morning bulletins, but there's no overnight editor who looks at the content that gets produced until 12 midnight and look at what has not been used but that was generated, and look at content that's not time-bound that could serve as morning stories. That didn't exist. So these are the things that we are trying to address. But also, when I came in, what we have as a 24-hour news channel, the SABC News channel, had no editor. Literally a free-for-all depending on who's available to lead it or who's interested in putting content in it. And you would have people moving in and out and shouting at executive producers as to what they want to see on TV. So this is the environment that I found, but we are also in the process of addressing that because we are now only hiring a person who's going to be responsible for that area. Not that we wouldn't have done it earlier, but because of the several moratoria that have been imposed on the SABC and SABC News, we were not able to fill those positions. And again, talking to the inadequacies that we've had to deal with in the system. Just before elections, we went to covering elections with 18 reporters out of the system. And these are people that we lost to either retirement or people resigning, looking for greener pastures, or people who just decided that they no longer want to be with SABC. So we have not been able to fill those roles. So the problems and the issues are multifaceted. So it's not one thing that you would say, this is why we are here. It's a lot of problems that have been allowed to fester in the system.
Yes. And thank you. And then you deal in paragraph 19 with coordination of the work of the SABC or the news division. Could you just take us through that as to what do you mean by that? And how is that going to enhance the workings of the SABC?
When you talk about coordination, you first look at our mandate as a news division. We're supposed to provide content that's untrammeled to the public with no interference of any nature. So you get into this environment where there are no controls in place. And I want to go back a bit and talk to the point where I was joining the SABC. I got into the system as a journalist, primarily. And the second point is that I'm a business management professional. Politics have got nothing to do with me. I never signed up for political activism within the news division of the SABC. And I was never asked to lead a political branch within the SABC. So when we talk about the absence of processes, one, you look at the fact that over the years, the first question when you come in is to ask, how does this division does its work? How does it do its work? And how, from the point of story ideation to the point where the story gets to air, how do you account for the processes in between? That is not documented. If you were at any point to wipe out that division, you would have to go elsewhere to find a way of re-establishing it because it's not written, the work is not documented anywhere. The three processes that drive the work of that division, news gathering, news processing, and news dissemination, not a single one of those processes is documented. So this is the environment that I found. And it's only now that we are starting to work on documenting workflows. But none of those are documented.
How is that different from what the one witness from the SABC, who's an archivist, Mr. Scott, he was a senior, yes, a senior personnel, who came to testify and told us about the archives that the SABC keeps. Is what you're talking to different from that?
It isn't different. It's part of the same problem.
Yes.
Our archive system, I'm trying to find the right word for it. But as it is, you have a system that still operates on tapes. We're probably one of the last few broadcasters that are still operating on a tape system. And that costs us about 6 million rand a year because we're paying for those who are no longer using the system. So where things are, so these tapes are stacked in Auckland Park, and you'll find them across the country in the different regions. And some of the content that is in these tapes has deteriorated in quality. You're not even sure if you will find anything if you were to try and use those tapes, looking for whatever that concerns you at that point. And as a result of the tape system, no one knows for certain that what we had in 2013 is still available. Because some of these tapes get lost, and I had been told that some of them walked out of the building. And that's the terminology, they walked out of the building. So we can't even say with certainty that we have the material that we think we have.
When you say this is not documented, do you mean processes that are followed in the production of news, yes, or do you mean if somebody says on the 15th of February 2013 you had this news item, I would like to go back to it, you mean you would have no guarantee that you can find it? Or is it both?
It is both. The material is not catalogued properly. And you can attribute that to either people working there not knowing how to do it properly, or because there is no proper archiving system that's digital. We're still working on analog and old modes of doing things.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. And then you deal with commercial opportunities. How do these relate to all the gaps that you have dealt with from paragraph 30 at page 8?
The commercial opportunities that I'm referring to here, it is generally known that because of the mandate that we carry as the news division, it's difficult to commercialize news content because the SABC policy prohibits us from doing so. But there are things that we can do. And in fact, let me make the first reference to us being here. This is part of the public mandate that we're supposed to carry, that we broadcast these commissions. The cost of broadcasting these commissions is not taken care of in the sense of the public mandate. We don't have money that accounts for the public mandate that we are expected to deliver on. So this commission has been running for more than a year now. And the arrangement that we have as broadcasters, so you would have ENCA doing 1 week, we take their feed, and us doing another week, they take our feed. That's how we manage the costs. But the reality is, it doesn't matter how you do it, we still have to foot the bill despite the fact that this project is a public mandate. So you look at this and you look at other things that we are expected to cover. For instance, host broadcast services. When we are asked by government and agencies to provide host broadcast services, again, I'm going to use a recent example when the former president appeared here. We were the ones who were providing feed that day. And the expectation is that every media house that wants a feed is going to come to us. We had more than 15 media houses, including international media houses, that had to plug on our feed. We are the ones who have to carry the cost. They get away without paying anything. And because it's a public mandate, but no one is taking care of it.
But I would have thought that the arrangement with other stations would be you can get this, but you'd have to pay because we can't be the only ones paying and you just get the benefits.
That is exactly what we are supposed to be doing, that we start charging for people who want to feed from us because we have to foot the bill for the deployments that we have to make to cover these big stories.
But why wouldn't it have been done from the beginning to say, well, because I do recall when we started here, I was informed that there was an arrangement that could be made in terms of which one, station, SABC, it was said could be here, and then other TV stations would get it from them. And I asked if that was acceptable to all concerned, and I was told yes. And I said, okay, that's what will happen. But I would have assumed that SABC would say, well, if you want this, this is what these are the costs associated with us, and you can't just come and get the benefits, you'll have to pay as well.
It is only now that we are thinking along those lines, but previously it has been the case that because we're a public broadcaster and we therefore have to provide the facilities without any compensation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just one, there has to be a distinction, am I correct, between a state broadcaster and a national broadcaster, or is there no difference at all? Or a public broadcaster, as you put it?
There is a difference, and the difference is huge.
Yes.
Our editorial policy is clear about who we are. And it's actually explicit about us not being a government mouthpiece and serving political interests. It's very clear in that regard. We cover government, but we are not the mouthpiece of government. Just one example that I know does get people angry. That when I go to work, I don't announce that I go to work because I get paid for what I do. So if you're going to invite a public news service when you switch on a tap or when you cut a ribbon, that's a problem. And there's a problem with the people who take editorial decisions to do such. You can still cover the story. You cover it from the perspective of the communities that are affected by whatever is happening. You're getting water after 25 years, or you're getting water after a year. But the fact that a tap has been switched on cannot be a story. As a public broadcaster and as a public news service, we decide how we apply what is our mandate to our editorial decisions, and our stories have to reflect that.
Yes.
Thank you. Talking about the SABC's mandate, could you please turn to page 19? This is one of your annexures to your statement, which is the SABC editorial policy. But page 19, that's where the mandate is outlined.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Thank you.
Could you just place on record briefly the bullets that are there? And powers, functions, rights, and obligations.
Okay. Reflects South African attitudes.
Maybe you should start with the chapter.
Start with the
or even the first sentence is fine. Yes.
Okay. The SABC's mandate as a public broadcaster comes from the Charter, which defines its objectives. The Charter is laid down in Chapter 4 of the Broadcasting Act, as amended, and requires the SABC to encourage the development of South African expression by providing in the official languages a wide range of programming that reflects South African attitudes, opinions, ideas, values, and artistic creativity that displays South African talent in educational and entertaining programs, that offers a plurality of views and a variety of news, information, and analysis from a South African point of view, that advances the national and public interest.
Yes. And those are the objectives that you say you subscribe to?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. And then may we then go back to your statement? Have you finished explaining these commercial opportunities that you dealt with? But I think if you have, but I would like you to take you to paragraph 30.2, page 9, where you deal with the pricing system of your archival material. And this is one of the matters that Mr. Scott dealt with, and it relates to content that was given to AN7. So it's a matter that is important for the work of the Commission. So could you just tell the chairperson what is it that you want to convey there?
What we have here, even outside the material that links to what happened with AN7, the pricing structure of our archive material when we license it to parties that are interested in the content is such that there is no discrimination in the content. Whether the content is unique, whether the content is exclusive to the SABC, and looking at the age of the material and the novelty of the material, there's a flat structure. So it's a flat price that we charge. It's 2,000 Rand per minute, regardless of the fact that some of that material cannot be reproduced. And this is something that we are now addressing with our intellectual property unit because it cannot be allowed. And there's a lot of value that we lose as a result of the current arrangement.
Okay. Thank you. And then you deal with another opportunity at paragraph 30.3.
Yes.
Dealing with outside broadcasts.
Okay. Outside broadcasts, the Group CEO did make a reference to these arrangements. These are stories that we cover over and above our general deployments. For instance, if you have to cover a story, you deploy a reporter, deploy a video journalist. If it's radio, you deploy a radio reporter. If it's digital, you deploy a person who's going to take care of those needs, or assign the two from radio and TV to make that content available for our digital platforms. So in this case, the projects or broadcast projects that we would charge for as outside broadcasts are those that are beyond our general coverage. They require bigger deployments in terms of resources. And this is where we start charging for our coverage, which is not necessarily the content, but it's the deployment, the cost of deploying resources to cover these stories. The number of journalists that you're going to send, the multi-camera requirements for the story that you'll be covering. So you look at all of that, and then you would say, this is how much it's going to cost us. If we were to hire out these facilities, this is what we would get. And therefore, this is what it costs us to cover the story. And in the way it's been done, it was handled by executive producers who would decide. And it's always been around 50,000 Rand, regardless of the extent of deployments. And the arrangement that we have now, it's with commercial enterprises because it's not only about the resources that are deployed, it's the airtime that the client would have derived value from by us putting the content on air. And in some of the cases, it's more than an hour, but you pay for 5,000, which only covers part of the deployment costs.
Thank you. Okay. And then the next paragraph, you deal with advertising in the news. I'm not sure whether it's in the newsroom, or what do you mean by saying that generally advertising there is not allowed? Does that mean that when there's news, you can't show clientele What does it mean?
Again, this is a policy issue. We are not allowed to advertise news, and it's out of fear of commercial influence in our content. The only advertising that's allowed, it's during ad breaks. Commercial, yeah, we call them commercial ad breaks, or the time we take a break and go elsewhere. So these are the slots that you would use for advertising. But for some reason, there was a point within the SABC when there was an understanding that advertising is not allowed. You're not supposed to place any commercial content on our news programming, which is not necessarily the case where you have ad breaks. Because even if you look at our free-to-air channels, SABC 1, 2, and 3, they are ad breaks, and this is how we generate revenue. The only thing that is prohibited is sponsorship of news content, of current affairs content. You can do sponsorships around informal knowledge building programming, which is your shows like travel trends. In this case, you would look at interesting places to go to or to visit in South Africa. And it's your health tips shows, it's your personal finance tips, it's things that are not necessarily hardcore news that you would be covering that require hard editorial treatment. So there are opportunities to generate revenue. But again, it's a space that we are only getting into now.
Yes. And by the way, just on advertising, just as a matter of interest, how does it work? Because you'll find that one company gets exposed more than any other company. Does it go according to the cost or the money that company pays the SABC, or does it depend on the reaction of the public to that particular advertisement? How does that work?
The scheduling of adverts depends on the airtime bought by the client. That's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So the more money you have and the more more airtime you buy, the more you get shown.
Correct.
Thank you. You've already dealt with, you used this commission as an example when dealing with 30.6, am I correct?
Yes, correct.
Thank you. And then, so now you get there, you find the state that you've already described to the chairperson. So what are the interventions then?
The kind of interventions that we've had to make, the first thing that we had to do was to look at the setup in the newsroom. Our mandate, what had gone wrong, what we needed to do differently. So that was our starting point. And related to that, we had to think about the fact that we say, as a public news service, our duty is to provide critical watchdog journalism, not just information about what is happening. That is our duty. And part of our mandate is to ensure that we enhance the democracy of the country by doing the things that we are doing in providing information, assisting citizens with the right information so that they make the right decisions. But there's something that we always say, while it's okay for us to say we are the eyes and ears of the public in how we do things, holding authority to account, whether it's politicians, government, or business, what we are not is the voice of the voiceless. We like to make that claim, and it sounds right when we do so. There's an Indian author, Arundhati Roy, who talks to this issue. And her view is that there's no such thing as a voiceless. It's only those who are deliberately silenced or those who are preferably unheard. So our task as a public news service, it's not to be the voice of those people. They have the voice. We need to find those voices. We need to go to the areas where these people are and elevate their voices, get them to talk about their issues, not us speaking on their behalf. It's not our job to do that. We don't want to interpret their views. We don't want to interpret their opinions. And in this case, when you look at what had happened, and what we needed to fix. We needed to go back there and say, if our task is to ensure that there's plurality of views in our news content, and there's inclusivity in our coverage, how do we do that? And these interventions were meant to address the how do we do so. So the first thing was to say, looking at the lapse of editorial controls, if they were ever there, what are the things that we would have to say are the filters for editorial decision making? And this is how we ended up with the two values, independent and impartial, which are part of our value system in our editorial policies. And we looked at those for this very reasons of interference that has been seen as a problem within the SABC news system. So in doing this, we were trying to say to journalists, in every decision that you make in your own space, because everybody is a decision maker in a news gathering system, from the person who decides which story is going to be told, or that this is even a story, to the person who decides to take the story to air, to the video journalist who decides to film this part and not the other part, to the video editor who decides that this is what I'm going to show and not this one. Everybody in the chain is a decision maker. So it was important to say to the newsroom, in the context of these two editorial pillars as filters, this is how you make your decisions. Are you going to be able to say, this story has been produced independently? There's been no influence in how I decided on how I did this story. Is there political influence? Is there commercial influence? Are my personal prejudices in the way of me deciding on how I do the story? So that also included introspection from the point of view of the journalists who are doing the stories. So it is helpful for us to say, with these two pillars, we are able to guide editorial decision making. You can't be referring everything upwards when you know that if I test my story against these two pillars, I'm comfortable that I've done the right thing. Or if I'm not comfortable, what are the things that I need to do? At the level of impartiality, am I fair enough in the way I've covered the story? Do I have all the sides that need to comment on the story? Or if I'm not finding all the voices, what are the opportunities that I have to present the other voices when they become available? So our starting point was in this area. And because we were also expected to be inclusive in our coverage, we had to say, what does that mean? It's not only being inclusive in terms of the people who are around you, or the voices that are always available for commentary. We hardly see women as expert voices in our news coverage, as economists, as researchers, or anything that you want expert advice or counsel on. So we had to think about how, as a newsroom, are we going to include these voices in our stories? And it's a conversation that takes place in our editorial meetings. What are the voices that we're going to use to make sure that this story is resourced properly and we are comfortable that it's ready to go to air? And not only the fact that we are looking at women, we're also looking at women in rural areas. And in this case, you would say, if uMamqoqo kuNdlovukazi needs access to information, are we providing uMamqoqo the kind of information that requires where she is? Or are we telling this woman about brown rice and lentil issues that affect people who are sitting in Sandton and the middle class? So these are the conversations that we now get involved in our editorial decision making. But it's all driven by what is it that the editorial policy requires us to do in the way we cover stories. And we have gotten to that mode where on a daily basis we would say, but what does the editorial policy say? What does the editorial policy say? So it's no longer about just assigning stories. And this also includes the allocation of resources to stories. You can sit here and say, we don't have a live facility, which are the devices that we use to do live coverage that are portable. We don't have a live facility to go to this story, but there is a live facility that's allocated to a different story. And we look at these two stories and say, which of the two stories is likely to have more impact on the public, or that has more people being affected by this issue? It could be something that's happening in one of the informal settlements, but it's only an example of an issue that could have a national scale if you look at other areas in the country. So you treat your stories and your allocation of resources in that context. So these are the conversations now that are taking place in our newsroom. But the other part to the answer is, I got in an environment where we had 3 platforms that were running parallel. You had diary meetings for radio, diary meetings for TV, diary meetings for digital. And you would find instances where radio gets surprised when they see a story on TV, TV gets surprised when they hear a story on radio, digital is the same, because they don't talk to each other. So the plan was to say, looking at technological convergence that's taking place already, and looking at how people are consuming news, and saying, we need to do that at the point of production. Starting with story ideation, how do we look at the story idea as a starting point and not the platforms as a starting point, TV, digital, and radio? How do we, as SABC News, say, this is our story for the day? How do we make sure that this story is reflected adequately across all the platforms? And we got to a point where we now integrate diaries. We have 2 diary meetings where everybody sits, digital, radio, and television, and we say, we have this story idea. How are we going to treat it? We discuss that part. How does it relate to the work that we're expected to do as a public news service? We deal with that part. What are the resources that are going to be deployed? How many reporters are going to go to this story, and who is going to cover the story for radio, for TV, and digital? But it's a single conversation for everyone within the news service. And we took the approach of a news service instead of the different platforms that we have been using.
And that talks to improvement of the systems that are going to work going forward.
Yes, it's the efficiencies within the system, but editorially, it's also to ensure consistency in quality and tone, because the stories are likely to be different depending on the audiences, but the quality has to be the same. And it's the kind of quality that you want the audiences to say, I've been listening to this story, or I've been watching this story, I can tell that this is an SABC News story. So this is the point that we're trying to get at. But in terms of managing efficiencies, we are able now to say, reporter A and B, especially now that we haven't been able to fill the positions of reporters that we've lost, the 18 reporters that we have lost, we're able to say, there's a reporter who can also do radio. Let's deploy this person, because this person is multi-skilled. So we don't have to deploy the 3 reporters that we would deploy, or 2 reporters that we deploy to a story. So it also assists us manage our efficiencies.
Okay. And then just one thing that you omitted to mention in paragraph 31 is the commissioning of the investigation that was done by Mr. Joe Tlolwe, which you make reference to in that paragraph. Am I correct? And that is annexed, that report is annexed as MPM002, and it appears from pages 71 right up to page 136.
That is correct.
Is that correct? Yes. Thank you. Then you deal with the steps that you took. This is what we're dealing with. You mentioned something that you did between March and May of 2018, going through all the stations, and what results did that? What did you achieve by doing so?
In March, between March and May,
Yes.
I visited all the offices across the country. And the intention was to assess the state of health of the offices. Because if I was to do any work, or we were to do any work as a division to try and change things, I needed to understand if the system is going to support the change that was required. So going to the different offices, some of the challenges that were there related to infrastructure issues, technological infrastructure. You had reporters who would go to stories with notebooks. No one does that in this day and age. They have to come back to the newsroom and script their stories. They have no laptops or iPads to ensure that as they are sitting there, the information is sent to the newsroom for broadcast. So their counterparts from other media houses, by the time they leave the room, the story is already on air. Ours have to go back to the newsroom before our stories get to air. And in some of the cases, you had instances where reporters have to...
Maybe that helps me understand why sometimes I hear a story today in one or other TV station or radio station, and I only hear tomorrow in SABC. And I wonder, what's wrong with SABC? They are telling us old news. Maybe that's why.
I'm traumatized.
No, quite truly, I've wondered. I say, really, we had this yesterday, and they're only telling us now. Okay, all right.
It's a number of issues, but that is also part of the problem.
Yes, thank you.
And you would have instances where reporters have to travel long distances. A province like KZN, if you're going to take inclusivity seriously, you are going to cover the country's rural provinces, and you are going to cover those voices that are sitting in those provinces. So you drive 500 kilometers to a story, cover the story, come back because you have to drive another 500 kilometers to the office in Durban. That's 1,000 Ks on the road in one day. You still have to get to the system and process the story. And the system is not reliable. Or some of the facilities have fallen apart to the extent that you have to queue to edit your stories. By the time you leave the office, it's almost midnight. And this is what we have done to our reporters. And not only that people have to find themselves working long hours, which is not out of the norm in our area, but the fact that people have to drive such long distances, we can't book them to sleep over because we don't have money. So you expose them to danger by expecting them to drive to and fro in such long distances. And they have to do so because they don't have editing facilities that are mobile, where they could be booked over, process their stories, send them to the newsroom, drive back the following day. We don't have that luxury. We want to meet the mandate, but at the cost to the journalists who are out in the field.
Thank you. You've dealt already with the values of independence and impartiality and repositioning the SABC. I think that takes care of what you deal with in paragraphs 32.2 right up to 32.5, because you also dealt with the diaries, single diary, although you have where you dealt with the meetings that you now have twice a week, yes, of all the stakeholders. Then I think we should move on. If you're comfortable that you've covered everything there, we could move on now to the impact of the changes that you've effected so far. When I say you, I mean you and your those that work with you in improving the systems.
Yes, we can move. Yes. From an editorial point of view, the one thing that I had to do was to demonstrate the change I wanted to see in the system. I remember one instance during the period when we were covering the late Mrs. Madikizela Mandela's funeral, walking into the control room, just observing how the work was being done, and I picked up a spelling error. and I'm pointing out to the person who is dealing with that part in production. And this person says, "Can you please do it for me?" And I pulled the chair, and she moved, and I got into the chair, and I typed out the word I wanted changed. And it's not a case of a person who was saying, "Do it yourself." It's someone who didn't know the right spelling that needed to be reflected. So these are instances where you had to say, "I am serious about the things that I'm asking you to change." We have a very interesting setup. You would have the executive producer deciding on what needs to be done. But it's the technical crew that gets all the material to air. And some of the people who are sitting in the control room are not editorially strong. And some of them are not even people that you can rely on if you talk about spelling errors on air. And it's been a perennial problem. And there are serious issues around that because these are the people you have, and this is the quality that you have in the system, and you still have to work with them because there's nothing you can do. You found them in the system, and you're going to have to work with what you found in the system. So we had, during the same period, and it's something that I've come to be known for, and we joke about this in the newsroom. There's a phrase, I don't even know whether to call it a phrase, when an event is happening. So we'd be talking about the event being underway. So the fight over this underway, whether it's one word or two words, is a big fight within the newsroom. And it took time for us to settle on whether it's two words or one word. And you basically have to go to a point where you say, when you have a noun following the word, you literally explain how it's one word in a sentence and how it's two words in a sentence. So these are things that you have to demonstrate because you are not going to change a system by shouting instructions. You have to be part of the things that you want to see change. And this is, I know it's very granular, but it's a big issue if you have problems at that level. And as part of the impact, at an editorial level, I have asked everyone to stand up and be courageous to do what is right and what the editorial policy says in the interest of the citizens who rely on us for information. And I had to demonstrate that myself. The first instance was when we were taken to the BCCSA by the Democratic Alliance. For a clip that we played, it came from an address by President Ramaphosa. And in the way it was processed in the system, again, this talks to the quality that we have in the newsroom. The way it was labeled, it said, "The president addresses the nation." And yet the clip was about an outcome of an ANC lekgotla. So he was addressing an ANC issue, not as the president of the country. And it was obvious in the tape because you could see the flags of the ANC behind him, and he was wearing ANC regalia. But we said, "The president addresses the nation." And it became a big problem. And we were taken to the BCCSA because there was a view from the Democratic Alliance that we were again being used to carry we were carrying instructions from the ANC, which was not necessarily the case. It was a fault of our system that we ended up with that. And it's something that we corrected within the first 7 minutes or first 10 minutes of us airing that because we picked up the problem, but it was already late at that point. And added to that It was about the fact that we did not give the other side an opportunity to respond because this was an issue of national concern. It was about land, employment, and other issues that were part of that address. So, us being taken to the BCSA, it was about we had violated the BCSA code by not giving the other party it's an opportunity to respond, and the fact that we had called what was an ANC issue, a presidential issue, as in the president of the country. But where the problem was, the BCSA is the right mechanism to address the issue, and which is what I stuck to. I was then called names, including being referred to someone who's not different from the Saudi era, which is what was said in the statements that were issued or the comments that were made. What was the problem was the fact that we were then given a tape as a response to what the ANC had put out by the Democratic Alliance that we should play it because we had played the ANC one. Under normal circumstances, and in the context of the editorial policy of the SABC, that cannot be done. We cannot be taking instructions from external parties. The editorial prerogative resides with the newsroom. We make decisions as journalists within the SABC. We cannot be told what to do. And this is where the problem was, because I was not going to give in. I remember there was even a countdown to 12 midnight that I was left with so many hours to play this tape. And I was not going to give in to that. And it was also to demonstrate to the journalists within the newsroom that you will not buckle under political pressure when you know that there are mechanisms to address issues. And we went to the BCSA, and the BCSA ruled in our favor. The second instance related to the impact of the changes that we also had to demonstrate how we needed to do things. There was an incident in February this year, and it was a public incident when the Minister of Communications interfered with our coverage in the Eastern Cape. It was the launch of a provincial manifesto of the party. And when that incident happened, the reporter posted the message on the group. We have WhatsApp groups, so we have a reporters group, and I mean all of them. You have a WhatsApp group for reporters, WhatsApp group for TV management, WhatsApp group for radio management and executive producers. And I exist in all those spaces because I want to understand the things that people are concerned about, because those are the platforms that at times people express what their concerns are when they're out in the field, whether they are being intimidated, and it's things that never get to reach me or would never get to reach me if I wasn't part of the discussions. And by being part of those groups, I'm able to address issues on the spot. So when that incident happened, the reporter who was covering the story posted the message on the groups. And I responded and said, "Do you have it on camera?" And she said, "Yes." And I thought, this is a remote area from our office in Mthatha. So how do we get this story quick enough? And then she indicated that she could do a live crossing, and I said, "Put it on record." And I had to say it in the group so that everyone understands that this is a decision that I've taken, and this decision is within our editorial policy, that we will not conceal information that we have knowledge of. And even worse, that it included an incident of censorship. Just one thing on censorship, it's despicable. You cannot rationalize it, you cannot negotiate your way around it. There's no way you can justify censorship. It's anti-democracy, and it goes against the right of the public in terms of access to information. There was no way that that incident was not going to be aired. And it was also to strengthen the courage of our reporters in the newsroom and our journalists in the system, that push back when you feel that there are things that are being done and you are aware of, and you know that they are against the electoral policy of the SABC. And we had to take that stance. And I'm aware of the fact that the kind of changes, the impact of the changes I'm talking about relate to editorial issues. Those are the most pernicious and that affect our integrity mostly. We had another incident in January. This is the same week that the country or the IEC was going to conduct the final registration week, voter registration week, which was the 25th, 26th January. This is a Monday. And the previous week, we had discussed how we were going to tell the story of the final voter registration in an impactful way. There's a graphics unit that would deal with on-air elements, what you'll be seeing on air on the day, what is going to be our promos leading up to the day about why it's important to go and register and that this is your last chance. So as we're discussing on-air elements the previous week, then on Monday, I'm sitting in the editorial meeting, sending message to the person who's supposed to design the on-air elements. How far are we with this? Because we had touched on it in preparation for the weekend. And leaving the meeting, I went to the floor where the graphics department is located. And then the person says, oh, I was a bit delayed. There was something else that I was doing that required my urgent attention. And I asked, what is this about? And he says, oh, no, there's an opening sting for a new segment that's being introduced. This was the 21st of January. It's a new segment that's being introduced by one of the desks. And I look at it because I asked him to play it. And then he plays it. The President's Office. This is the new segment that's being introduced. I am not aware of it. I have no knowledge of this thing being introduced. No one has said anything to me. So I then get to ask, you're saying that this thing is urgent. How urgent? And he says, this show is supposed to be, or this segment is supposed to be on air at 10. This was just before 10 o'clock in the morning. And the show that's supposed to go on air, it's on the 3rd floor. Immediately, I walked to the 3rd floor. Getting there, talking to the desk, what is this thing about? And then I get told, no, this is a new segment, and we thought that it's okay, that we're going to invite people from the office of the president on a weekly basis every Monday. So this is a dedicated slot to come and talk about the program and the engagements and the work of the office of the president. I have no knowledge of this.
How does that happen? How does something like that get to be, how do the plans get finalized for something like that to be aired without you knowing?
This is what puzzled me to this day, because I don't know how we ended up with that, but all I got from the executive producer at that time was that, no, it's an idea that we came up with and we thought that it was okay to do it. Because it was very close to the time, and the person who was supposed to speak at 10 on this segment was already in the building, on the floor, makeup done, ready to go to air. And I'm still standing here trying to find out what happened. And I had no way of saying we're not going to do it, as I was still seeking answers myself. Then I went to my office. Got to my office, I couldn't get myself to watch it, because I knew at that moment that we would have, by having that material on air, it was a violation of the editorial policy of the SABC. It went against everything that the public news service stands for. And besides the fact that it was against the editorial policy of the SABC, it had implications for the regulations by ICASA in terms of our elections coverage, because we were already in that period. So what you have in the regulations by ICASA is that broadcasters, in particular in this case as a public news service, we have to be mindful of the advantage of incumbency. So we would have to explain why before elections we're having this segment, which is a weekly dedicated to the office of the president. Because despite the fact that it's the office of the president and not of a party, there are issues of the advantage of incumbency that we need to deal with. And ICASA is explicit about how this plays out, that there's always a chance that the party that's in power could use resources of the state to enhance its electoral prospects. It's in the regulations. It's not something that I'm making up. And I was mindful of that at that point. So there was no way that I was going to allow that to go on air. So that was the first and the last episode of that segment.
Ms. Norman, it looks like we have covered quite a lot of ground.
Yes, Chair. But
Yes.
yes, we actually...
I don't see anything else that I think we have
Maybe
covered.
just to allow her to gloat about the Reuters Institute. Yes, you mentioned that in paragraph 38.
Yes, this is our bragging rights. As a result of the changes that we have effected, we have, for our coverage of the elections, been acknowledged for providing fair coverage. And of more than 3,000 items that were analyzed on our free-to-air platforms on radio, 99% of them were found to be fair, which was a big thing for us as a news division. And the report by Reuters, they ran a digital survey. And what happened in this case, they test news consumers with regards to how they trust the news content they consume and the media houses they would be consuming the news content from. Out of 13, we were number 4, which is a big thing for us coming from our past, which is very recent, and the things that have happened. So this is what we found joy in, that here's an international institute that has done a digital survey in South Africa. Out of 13 media houses, we are ranked 4. It's a big thing for us. It was a big thing for us.
And this happened when?
June. It was
June this year.
Yes,
thank you. So with the turnaround strategy and the interventions that you've put in place, you're happy with the way forward that the SABC is embarking on insofar as editorial matters are concerned and newsroom affairs are all concerned?
I'm happy, but there's serious work to be done. We still have to put in strict editorial controls, and we still need to get everyone to understand the work of a public news service, not a state broadcaster. And in terms of our cost containment measures, which form part of the strategy that my principals were talking about, coming out of elections and the fact that we went to elections without money, for a national project and for a sensitive project like our democracy, we started with a budget of above 80 million rand when we were discussing the budget. But we then had to say to ourselves, if we were to do things differently, how would this assist us to bring the costs down? We then went and looked at things that we could cut out, and we're down to 54. And this is more or less where we were in 2016 in our elections coverage. And it started to feel comfortable at 54. But we then said, what are the things that are not core to our elections coverage that we can get rid of again? But also looking at the fact that we have invested in technology. We have these hybrid vans that we are using that each province has now, and other things that assist us in doing our work differently and better. So what was not going to happen is to have us investing in technology heavily, but still seeing the price of covering elections going up. So we needed to see the benefit of our investments in technology. And we revised down our budget and settled at 29 million rand to cover elections. But still, we had to look at things that didn't make sense in the budget, that didn't have to be there, because all we needed to do was to tell the South African story, the story of this election, and how it relates to citizens and the role of citizens in deciding who becomes the sixth administration, and say, what is it that we don't want as part of this budget? But this is now in the process of delivering our elections. We had to look at a lot of things, but as we're closing the account about 2 weeks ago, we spent less than 10 million rand in covering elections. But the question you start asking yourself, if we were sitting at 54 million rand in 2016, where did that money go? What was done with that money? If we could produce an election with less than 10 million rand. And as part of that project, I remember in my first months, because the process of budgeting had started already, there is a system that's called an election results system, which is meant to pull data from the elections portal, the IEC portal, and process it for our storytelling. So a document comes to me, it lands on my desk, it's from our media technology infrastructure unit. It's a business case to procure the system for 21 million rand. Having been outside the SABC system, we knew that that thing never worked. We admired it when we were told that, oh, SABC is going to have this thing. But we knew that at the point where the results had to be processed, that thing never worked. 2014, we spent about 8 million rand in that system. 2016, we spent close to 10 million rand in that system. It never worked. It never worked, but we were going back to procure the same system. And on the 2 occasions, it was from the same company. And as this business case was presented to our senior meetings, our supply chain management pointed out that it looked like it was tailor-made to the same company that provided the 2014 and 2016 system that never worked. Just to go back a bit, how it got to the senior management committee. Looking at this, knowing that it never worked, my response was, I'm not going to sign this document. The news division doesn't need it. We don't need the system. It went away, but came back. And I still said, we don't need the system. We'll find other ways of telling the South African story differently for television and for our online platforms. Then it shows up during the senior management meeting without my signature. Without my signature. Now I have to say, I had said that we don't need the system. And I'm sitting with people who are trying to persuade me that you actually need the system because this is what it's going to do, this is what we're going to need it for.
The point should not even arise.
Exactly.
If you have the power to decide whether you need it or not, and you said you didn't need it, and somebody went against that, then there must be consequences.
Yeah.
You know, somebody's not going to try and persuade you after they have defied you to say you need it, particularly if there appears to be breaches of procurement processes.
Yes. And the question that I raised at that point was, when the system failed at that critical moment, what did you do to process your results? Oh, we had to work on a graphic system. And it was like, we have enough time now to start working on the graphic system and use that for our elections.
Well, I hope that it's something that's being investigated as to whether everything was done the way it should have been done in that regard. And that the investigators of the commission are taking note. Yeah.
When I realized that we had made payments in 2014 and 2016 for something that never worked, and we're trying to procure the same system. The question I asked, why is this not on the SABC's asset database? Why are we procuring the same system that we have bought twice previously? And we then referred it to our internal forensic investigation. Yes, it's being investigated.
Yes, so that process is still underway.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That's the evidence from this
Yes.
case. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming to share your evidence with us. We appreciate it. If we need you to come back, we'll ask you to come back. But thank you very much. You are excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the next witness is Ms. Yolande.
Let's not take the next witness yet.
Oh, thank you.
Let's adjourn.
Yes.
And I would like to see you for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
We are going to adjourn, and we should come back about 25 past 4. Is it 4? Yeah. Is it 3? Oh, no. Yes, yeah, no. All right, yeah. We'll come back 25 past 3. We adjourn. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you. The next witness is Ms. Yolande van Biljon, the Chief Financial Officer of the SABC. May she be sworn in, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please administer the oath for affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Yolande van Biljon.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I don't.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
I do.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
I do, so help me God.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in front of you would have Exhibit CC3. This was entered into evidence the first round of the SABC hearings. CC3.
The liver art file containing the, I see sworn affidavit.
Yes.
An affidavit is always a sworn statement.
Yes, yes.
It's either an affidavit or sworn statement.
Yes.
Affidavit of Ms. Yolande van Biljon will be marked Exhibit CC3.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Ms. Van Biljon, you've got the file in front of you?
Yep.
Am I correct? Okay. Could you please look at the statement that is there in front of you in Exhibit CC3, and please turn to page 5. Is that your signature on that page?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Yes. When you respond to the chairperson, always. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So the date, what is the date of the commissioning of that statement?
It is the 21st of May, 2019, sir.
Yes, yes, thank you. And in deposing to this affidavit, did you do so voluntarily?
I did, thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you. Is it correct that you are the Chief Financial Officer of the SABC?
Yes, Chairperson, I am.
When were you appointed?
25th of June, 2018.
Yes. You were asked by the investigators to deal with specific matters, am I correct?
Yes, Chair, I was.
Yes. Before then we deal with what you dealt with, could you just, for consistency, place your qualifications before the chairperson?
Chair, I am a chartered accountant and I've got a master's degree in taxation.
Yes. And before you joined the SABC, where were you employed?
I was employed at Denel and then at the Road Accident Fund and then for a few months at a place called Glad Africa.
At the?
A place called Glad Africa.
Glad Africa. Yes, thank you. Then you were asked specifically then to deal, one of the entities that you had to deal with, or maybe let me just put the question to you, what was it that was asked by the investigators?
I was asked to consolidate transactions with 3 entities, being Infinity Media Networks, TNA Media, and transactions with other similar clients, international and local.
Yes. What exactly were you looking for in compiling that information?
Payments made or received from or to the specific entities.
Yes, thank you.
Chair.
Yes, and is it correct that all of these transactions happened before your time?
Yes, Chair, they did.
And you relied on records that are within the SABC?
Yes, Chair, I relied on our financial system and the records that we could find.
Yes. Thank you. Let's start then in paragraph 7. You deal there with Infinity Media Networks. And you had concentrated on a particular period, is it? Am I correct?
Yes, Chairperson, I concentrated on the period October 2013 to March 2014.
So that's on, yes. And then where would one then find those documents that you rely on in that page? You have a reference YB1.
Yes.
Yes, and that's where you deal with the revenue.
Yes.
From, when you say revenue from Infinity Media, this is revenue received by the SABC from Infinity Media?
Yes, Chair, it was.
Yes. And then at paragraph 7.2, you testify, you deal with the fact that you were aware of the agreement between Infinity Media and the SABC
I did obtain information to that effect, yes,
relating
Chair.
to the agreement?
Yes.
And then you control, can you just go back then to YB1 and then see and look at the amounts that you were dealing with there in that paragraph, in that statement? You have a consolidated page of all the payments, am I right? At page 8, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry, just a second. Yes, Chair, I do.
You do, okay. Where are the amounts reflected there?
It is the last four amounts, starting with 159,600 rand.
Yes. And at the end, you've got 00. What does that mean?
That means it was invoiced and then subsequently paid, so the account is then 0.
Yes, thank you.
Is that in page 8?
Yes, page 8, Chair. 008.
Is there a way of making these figures bigger
Bigger.
and therefore more legible?
Could you be able to extract a more legible copy? We can replace it some other time.
We should be able to, because I guess the number of times it's been copied degraded the quality of it in any case. We should be able to.
All right.
Must I read it out perhaps for the sake
Yes,
of
please, for the
record?
record, yes.
So the first one would be 159,600 rand for 2,000 minutes to launch ANN7. And then 123,102 for 27-minute footage, ANN7 agreement, SABC copyright. I'm reading the text,
Yes.
Chairperson. The next amount is 91,200 for 20 minutes of footage used for mail, SABC copyright. And the last amount is 31,920 for 7 minutes footage, January to February 2014, as per declaration received.
Yes, thank you. And these, they relate to the purchase of archival material, am I correct?
Yes,
According to the records?
Yes, Chair, they
Yes. Thank you. And then you have the total amount, which you reflect at page 3 if you go back to your statement.
do. Yes, Chair.
Yes, what is that total?
405,840 rand, including VAT.
Yes, thank you. And then you moved on to the second entity, which is TNA Media. Could you just talk to the chairperson, what were you looking for there? You can read from that paragraph, the areas that you looked at.
Chair, I was requested to consider the transactions the SABC entered into with TNA Media, TNA. We concluded that they supplied us with newspapers on a weekly basis per paragraph 10.1.1, and the SABC provided the New Age with certain broadcasting services, and more particularly outside broadcasting services, which were then conducted at various venues across the country.
Okay. And then where do we find that? WYB2, it will be under, it starts from page 28.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, thank you. Could you just read into the record those, but these are quite legible. I don't know whether they are with you, Chair.
What page is that?
Page 28 is the covering letter, but the figures are at page 29.
So Chair,
Yes.
on page 29, the very last line item is TNA Media. You'll see transactions recorded from 2011 to 2018, amounting to a total of 908,035.57 rand for newspapers that were supplied to the SABC over that period.
So that covered which years?
2011 to 2018.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
And then you decided to put other newspapers, or were you doing just a comparison?
Yes, a comparison, and possibly it is in the same account in the general ledger in our financial system. It is allocated to the same GL account. Potentially that's why they are together there.
Okay, so if you were to print, you can't just print for TNA, you'd have to print for all.
I would would imagine so. I see all the SAP printouts attached, but it will be very difficult for me to identify TNA, but again, it is something that we can certainly explore at the office.
Yes. And you've already put the total, the 2018, that total includes all the years 2011 to 2018 of 908,000.
Correct, Chair.
Yes. And then the documents that follow from page 30, are those, what are those?
That would be, Chair, the supporting documentation that would make up the totals there. What is not clear, because there are no visible totals, is I presume it makes up the 908, but because the totals aren't visible or not reflected,
Yes.
we will have to check at the office.
Okay, but they will talk to the totals
Yes.
that you have on that page.
Yes.
Yes,
And
thank
it
you.
stretches a number of years, as if one can look at the posting dates, for example. So I take it makes up the values that's reflected in that table.
Yes. And then in paragraph 2, 10.4, sorry, if you go back to your statement.
In this paragraph,
Yes.
and the information provided here, it is clear that the SABC always state that the SABC was never paid, nor did the SABC invoice New Age for any of the so-called breakfast shows or any other outcast broadcasting services which were rendered by the SABC to the New Age.
Yes. So the outside broadcasting services, that's where the journalist, as Ms. Magopeni has testified, if a journalist goes out, equipment and the airtime and everything else. So they were never invoiced for that.
It's a combination of services, everything from the rental of the premises, technical equipment, satellite feed, traveling, transport, and a host of other things that's necessary to ensure that we're able to broadcast exactly like Ms. Magopeni stated.
Yes, thank you.
So the TNA Media was invoicing the SABC for the New Age, and SABC was paying for the newspapers, but SABC was not invoicing TNA for these outside broadcasts, and therefore TNA was not paying anything. They were having those for free.
Yes, Chair, that's what one can deduct. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And then in 10.5, you have some figures there, and you've totaled them, and you deal with them in YB3. What is reflected in YB3?
So in YB3 is a collection of the cost for these outside broadcasters that was provided to New Age. It amounts to a total of 4,268,887, excluding VAT. There is a table that was prepared, and it stretches from 2011 to 2017.
Yes.
I'm on YVB 030, page 38. And in terms of the types of cost are the things that I've just referred to, from the rental, technical equipment, etc.
Yes. So all these rental of facilities is reflected from page 39 onwards. So these are all the costs that the SABC incurred, but never recouped those expenses.
Correct, Chair.
Yes, thank you.
I hope that we will have a witness who will say who was supposed to make sure that this was not for free to TNA.
Yes.
Because it's important, and I assume at SABC it ought to be easy to know
Yes.
who would have been the person who should have made sure that
That they are billed.
no free service was provided for which should not have been provided for.
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And then you also were asked by the investigators to also deal with other commercial clients.
Indeed, Chair. I was asked to also review our records relating to any other transactions between commercial clients that have been buying news archives. It was my understanding that the rationale was to determine whether the pricing which was provided to Infinity was below the market rate. And as such, we did put together a table that speaks to some of our commercial clients we could identify.
Yes. And what did you find in your comparison?
So the table, which is reflected on page 169,
Yes.
reflects a number of organizations between years 2011 to 2015 and the kind of values that they paid. Companies include Al Jazeera, ZDF, German TV, Reuters Television, Associated Press TV, as well as some local broadcasters. We include the values there. My task was, however, not to do the comparison of the pricing. It was merely to record that there were sales in this respect.
Yes. And that is basically the evidence that you tendered as requested at the time by the investigators?
Correct, Chair.
Yes. And you were not, other than those requests, you were not asked to analyze anything further than what you have put up?
Not with respect to the transacting with these entities, no.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is the evidence from this witness.
Thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. You are now excused. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those are the witnesses for the day.
For today?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all right. How many have we got tomorrow, witnesses for tomorrow?
One, two, three. I think yes. There's 4 that you have on the list for tomorrow, Chair. 4 witnesses. Yes, 4. Yes.
4.
Yes.
They are, I guess they are all short.
Yes, there's one who might be longer, but the others are not long witnesses. Yes.
Yes, okay, all right.
But I think we could. Others are fairly flexible. If we find that we finish those early, we could move 1 or 2 of the witnesses.
Yes, okay.
Yes, thank you.
We are going to adjourn for the day, and tomorrow we'll start at 10 o'clock.
Thank you.
We adjourn.